When COVID struck, I felt very much like an old dog having to learn rather too many new tricks. The learning curve involved in making the transition from teaching with manuscripts to teaching online with digital manuscripts was one that I found at times rather dizzyingly precipitous. The specific challenge that I faced was to deliver online an 8-week option course on medieval manuscript studies for a master's degree in medieval history. The aim of the course is twofold. First of all, to help students to appreciate the differences between the forms in which texts were recorded and encountered in books in Western Europe in the Middle Ages from what we're familiar with in modern printed editions. And secondly, to provide them with the methods and analytical tools to place medieval manuscripts in their specific historical contexts of production, ownership, and use, as well as to introduce the technical vocabulary and other conventions with which to describe them. In pre-COVID times, this was done through 8 immersive 2-hour classes held in the Wren Library in Trinity College and in the Parker Library in Corpus Christi College, with the students handling the manuscripts, usually one between 2, and the 8 or so manuscripts available to them in each class, acting as illustrative examples of the issues being addressed in that particular class. Here is an outline of the issue or issues introduced in each of the classes. So class 1 introduced the students to medieval books as complex physical artifacts and to the potential flexibility of the quire structure of the codex form. Class 2 presented the various forms of manuscript evidence for medieval provenance. Class 3 posed the question, what is the text, who is its author, and how variously are texts identified and attributed in medieval manuscripts. And class 4 developed this question further by examining annotations, additions, and various forms of paratext. The second half of the course examined the manuscript presentation of particular categories of text, focusing upon those which, in one way or another, mark or record the passage of time. So in class 5, we looked at manuscripts containing national and local history in annals, chronicles, and histories. Class 6 at universal history, and in the final 2 classes we looked at texts associated with liturgical time. In class 7 as represented in liturgical calendars, and finally in class 8 as presented in compilations of saints' lives, homilies and sermons. I retained this pre-advertised framework of classes when the arrival of the Kent or Alpha variant required the transition to an online format. What was lost in the translation was the easy means for direct student involvement that the in-person teaching had enabled. Instead, the classes became more lecture-like, and much of the time was devoted to what is best characterized as PowerPoint illustrated surveys. In retrospect, I would say that what these did was to provide further exemplification of what is presented so admirably in written prose and hard copy photographic illustration by Tim Graham and Raymond Clemens in their superb textbook Introduction to Medieval Manuscript Studies. This was no doubt useful, and the students have been kind enough to say that it was, but I'm not convinced that it made the best pedagogical use of digital manuscripts, and the students were inevitably, for the most part, somewhat passive participants. Now, I was very fortunate to have a specialist in digital manuscripts participating in the Zoom seminars, namely Suzette Van Haren herself, and she offered some invaluable perspectives, especially in the opening and closing sessions of the course. When I reflect on how the course went, what seemed most successful both pedagogically and in terms of engaging the students, I found myself returning to a point that Suzette emphasized in the first class, that digital manuscripts need to be understood as entities in their own right, rather than as digital versions of physical manuscripts. This point, of course, has a large number of implications for how, or indeed whether, we should perceive digital manuscripts as surrogates for medieval manuscript books. But its particular resonance for me was how it should inform the content of an online course that introduced medieval history students to medieval manuscripts and that would still achieve the aims of the original course. For researchers, the great advantage of digital manuscripts is the ease and speed with which we can gain access to them and the sheer quantity of such evidence that is now available. But this risks being an embarrassment of riches when teaching an introductory course to graduate students. In my case, a course with the aim of providing a solid methodological foundation for students working within a historical framework to place a unique and complex artifact within its specific historical context or contexts, and to interpret it in the light of the current state of knowledge of the wider landscape of the production, ownership, use, and function of books of the relevant period. The picture I seek to convey to the students is one of both chronological and generic patterns of shared conventions on the one hand, and of the enormous diversity of scribal response to their exemplars on the other. Excuse me, of continuities of practice and of change, not to mention the inherently dynamic potential for the medieval manuscript codex to change hands and even shape. But how best can this be conveyed using digital manuscripts and their inherent characteristics and qualities? The temptation, and I speak for myself, is to want to show too much, to exploit the richness of the online digital resources that now exist. But this tends to tip the balance back too much towards the show and tell of the lecture survey, which does not facilitate student engagement. Instead, I would now seek to apply the principle of less is more and to adopt a slow approach to using digital manuscripts in teaching. It takes time for any viewer, whether or not they are already familiar with the appearance of medieval manuscripts, to absorb the visual information presented in each new image on the screen. This, however, can be facilitated by slowly building up familiarity from image to image, so that visual knowledge gained from one image can inform the eye as to what it should focus on in the next. The two-dimensional digital image and the computer screen are brilliant for comparing and contrasting how texts are presented on a single page or opening. And I found the compare and contrast approach to be an especially effective means of conveying that complex combination of continuities of scribal convention and the diversity of responses to their exemplar by individual scribes, if I focused upon a single textual tradition. So, for example, I found that in the third class on the identification and attribution of texts, the most effective segment was where I slowed down to focus in more detail upon two early witnesses to a collection of biblical reference tools that circulated widely in England and Normandy in the late 11th and 12th centuries. Here on the screen are digital images of the first opening in the two manuscripts, the one on the left from Christ Church, Canterbury, the one on the right from Rochester Cathedral Priory. These are two particularly closely related manuscripts. The one on the left, perhaps the exemplar for the other, or both deriving from the same exemplar. Students became gradually attuned to the overall appearance of the presentation of the texts in the two manuscripts as we worked outwards from the contemporary lists of contents recorded on the left hand of the first opening in each manuscript to how the texts themselves were presented in each of the manuscripts. So here we have the contemporary list of contents on the left-hand page of each opening and the beginning of the first text, Jerome's Hebrew Questions on the Book of Genesis, on the right. If we then home in on a detail of the list of contents and look at how the first and last items of this detail are recorded in the two manuscripts, it's possible to note significant variations in their wording between the two copies. This serves to illustrate the generally greater degree of freedom enjoyed by scribes when copying paratextual elements. But this was a freedom that was also experienced in the copying of certain kinds of text, and especially florilegia of select extracts, such as are represented by the first and last entries in the detail from the contents list shown on the screen. This becomes apparent if we then move to the copies of the texts themselves. If we look at the end of the first florilegium, the copy in the Christchurch manuscript on the left ends with a 6-line sententia attributed to Augustine. But this is not present in the Rochester manuscript, which ends with the preceding sentence, Astronomii diligenter exponunt. The scribe of the Rochester copy chose not to supply the final sententia attributed to Augustine in the Christchurch copy at this point. Instead, he moved it to the end of the second florilegium, where it followed on from a sequence of sententiae also attributed to Augustine. And so you've got that sequence beginning towards the top of the right-hand column and the highlighted in red label Augustinus, and then that moved sententia down at the bottom, not repeating the word, the name Augustinus, but simply idem, and then you've got the sententia beginning septies cardit. While the students' attention was being drawn to the content of the text, they were also becoming more attuned, more generally, to the visual stimuli provided by the images on the screen. This enabled them more easily to move from what is recorded in the two manuscripts to observe for themselves other similarities and differences in how the texts are recorded in two very similar books, and then to consider the range of possibility open to scribes in early Anglo-Norman England, and to think about the needs and constraints to which they might be responding. When the class is held in the Wren, we can have the two manuscripts side by side, which has its own rewards. But actually, for a group of students, the digital manuscript is especially effective in permitting close scrutiny of the contrasting ways in which two scribes have responded to the same exemplar. And of course, the virtual environment allows such comparison when the physical manuscripts are not in the same repository. I found the same increased degree of engagement from the students when showing them digitized images of an opening from 3 copies of the Eusebius Jerome Universal Chronicle. To illustrate continuity and change over time in scribes' handling of a particularly complex kind of historical text. One, a copy from the 5th century, now in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, seen here on the screen. A 9th century copy now in Merton College, Oxford, and a late 12th century copy in the Parker Library at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge. At first sight, there is an awful lot to take in. But by looking at the same part of the text, that recording the fall of Troy, embedded within the presentation of the rulers and events synchronous with that dramatic event, the students were able to build up their familiarity with highly complex images in an incremental fashion and to become more actively engaged in the process. In this 5th century copy, the synchronous information is spread in columns across the double opening. And the fall of Troy is recorded 4 times, Troia Capta, twice in red, twice in the ordinary ink, with 2 further pieces of information recorded for that year, one beginning A Captivitate Troiae on the left-hand page, and the other beginning Menestheus Moritur on the right. In the 9th century copy, the fall of Troy is similarly recorded across a double opening. First, at the bottom of each page, following the column with the synchronous presentation of the dates, and then again on the next opening at both the top and bottom of each page. The 2 portions of text beginning A Captivitate Troiae and Menestheus Moritur each have their own striking layout. If we then move to the late 12th century copy, here all the synchronous information has been compressed onto a single page rather than being spread across the double opening. And if we move in on the relevant portion of the section on the fall of Troy, which is in the lower half of the right-hand page, the eye seeks in vain to spot any heading recording Troia Capta. Instead, the event and the 2 portions of prose beginning A Captivitate Troiae and Menestheus Moritur are embedded within a longer account of the synchronous events of that year. Now, because of the time constraints of this presentation, I've not dwelt as long on each image as I would do in the class. And this is in itself a kind of object lesson in do as I say, not as I do. I suspect that there will always be the risk when so many manuscripts are digitized that the impulse to share as much as possible will take over. Aware of the manifold complexities presented by medieval manuscripts, I constantly find my default mode as a teacher is to try to introduce too much content. Instead, perhaps just as much can be conveyed more effectively through a small number of examples that are meaningfully related to each other. The challenge then is to find ways in which the digital manuscript can best help students learn how to look and see, rather than just myself, the teacher, doing a show and tell. Thank you.